Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 21. The Rock Holds. Ranald's host could see the smoke rising above Erin Rock in the distance. They quickened their pace without being ordered to. If the rock had fallen to the Amul, their victory the day before would lose most of its value. The king ordered his trumpeters to sound the advance every half-mile or so. Perhaps the Amul assaulting Raelf would hear it and pull back to face the approaching relieving force. Ranald suddenly feared that he had not supplied the defending captain with sufficient men to hold off such an overpowering enemy. It could well be that Erin Rock was already in Amul hands, and they would arrive merely to face the barbarians already occupying their former stronghold. The Black River fell away into a deep ravine as it approached the sea. The men marched over the plateau, reaching to the Arran coastline, eager for their first glimpse of the besieged fortress. The smoke was thickening in the breathless air, spreading out like the branches of a gigantic tree over the coastline. Soon they encountered the first of the enemy pickets. The barbarians set to watch the road to the west, scattered in consternation at the sight of so many Arranite soldiers. They had been led to believe that the Giri forces would prevent significant numbers of enemy reinforcements from reaching the rock. Yet the bulk of Arran's fighting men were marching down to the coast with banners flying and trumpets sounding. Quickly the barbarians fell back to warn their commanders. Ranald's men halted to form their battle lines. Below them an awesome sight met the eye. The rock was entirely overrun by enemy warriors, swarming over the causeway, the island, the walls of the fortress, up to the parapets where Raelf's men still struggled against them. There was no more room for a boat to land on the shore, though there had to be hundreds still floating in the bay. The charred and looted buildings of the dockside and town crawled also with columns of warriors waiting their turn to join the fight. Ranald tried to calculate the numbers they were facing. From what Hunnic had told him of the fighting on Heron Inrath, more than 10,000 of the Amul had to have perished there. Raelf's defense against the surprise attack and later assault on the town had accounted for 2,000 more. Then there was the 20,000 sent to support the Giri, as well as the many thousands already killed in the 2 days of siege against the rock. Even with more than 40,000 casualties sustained, the hordes below had to outnumber his host by almost 3 to 1. It was an intimidating sight. The Amul were at a distinct disadvantage, though. They had no room to make use of their superior numbers. A sizable proportion of their force was engaged in the savage fighting on the walls of the fortress. Thousands of warriors were still at sea in the war canoes. Ranald saw their opportunity. If he could press the enemy hard before they could deploy their full host against him, there was a chance of breaking the will of this great gathering early on. He would have to act quickly, though, and give them no room to regroup. Even before the formations were complete, he gave the order for the advance. The Arranites surged forward eagerly. They realized that the host below could not be allowed any chance to reform their formations. In any equal contest, things would go ill indeed for the much smaller attacking force. Eald's men on the left headed straight for the town. They would be the first to make contact with the Amul. The Duke halted his archers as soon as they were in range, and had them pour volley after volley into the enemy ranks. The Amul were turning their columns away from the direction of the causeway. In the town, the warriors were massing for a charge. Ranald directed the assault of the center and right wing, concentrating his efforts on the causeway. If he could wrest control of it from the barbarians, almost 20,000 would be cut off from the rest, stranded on the rock, with only a narrow bridge to allow access to the main battlefield. His archers loosed their arrows at the warriors on both sides of the causeway, putting them under pressure. The barbarians between the causeway and the town had faced about in their assault columns and pressed forward in a disorganized attack. They met the shield wall of the Aaronites in a violent clash, swinging club and spear in their wild, reckless way. Soon their death cries mingled with the whooping and shouts of battle madness. Again there was a terrific din as weapons crashed onto the steel of shield and helm. The trumpets repeatedly sounding the advance could hardly be heard, but the Aaronite soldiers shouted the commands of their sergeants as soon as they heard them, so that the entire line echoed what the trumpets were saying. Forward, ever forward they pressed, over the bodies of the fallen, shield locked with shield, thrusting with sword and spear, till their arms ached with the repeated effort, and the sweat and blood ran into their eyes to obscure their vision. When one would go down to an enemy blow or falter with fatigue, others pressed forward to take his place. Yard by yard they pushed back the wild men from the south, till the causeway was reached and secured. Wayne's flank pressed onto it, against the piecemeal defense of the Amul assaulting the fortress. Soon enough, his men had gained the far bank and set foot on the rock itself. A ferocious struggle followed, as the Amul tried to dislodge them, but the shield wall held, aided by the archers on the far shore. In the town, however, the Aaronites could make little headway. The buildings prevented them from forming effective lines, and the confused fighting that followed suited the Amul warriors better. There was cover also, among the structures, against the murderous rain of Aaronite arrows. The boats out in the bay, still filled with enemies, were turning back for the port. Soon these men would reinforce the Amul resisting in the town. The moment of crisis had arrived. Panik saw the sudden flash of his blade reflected in the eyes of the Viran next to him. Bior stood there, grim-faced and resolute, as well as 3 others still remaining from the battle on the island. He nodded to each in turn and lifted the blade with both hands, till it reached shoulder height. The air about him was wild and violent, a spawning pool for tempestuous power. On such a day, and in such a place of turmoil, one had to be careful not to overtax oneself with the opening blows. Rather rely on the men at one's back and the swiftness of the burning blade. They moved off as they had done on the battlefield the day before, slightly ahead of their advancing soldiers. Eald's men parted to let them through, shouting after them as they went, encouraged by the sight of such confidence. Once they were among the buildings, they increased their pace. Panik struck with force now, beating back the milling warriors with each blow. At his sides, the Viran kept the enemy attacks off him, parrying and dealing death. Behind them, the Inrathian warriors pressed forward in a wedge shape, preventing the Amul from encircling the little band. Panik felt the minds of the others close about him, their intentions and actions as easily discernible as if they were his own. The world had grown tight and small, populated by threats and allies, whirling steel blades directed at him, stabbing flashes of light blocking their way. He moved into the green, surrendering to the flow, not perturbed by the draining of his stamina, the never-ending enemy hordes. Not even when one of their number was wounded and fell back did he lose a step in the steady advance. Ranald saw the Inrathian spearhead slicing through to the docks. The Amul seemed to have no answer for the potency of the islanders. Most recoiled from the sorcerer's blades and their fiery sweeping, and were already in retreat when struck by the soldiers behind. Eald's men were also making headway now, slicing through the disorganized enemy ranks. A panic set in, and a rush for the dockside and the boats waiting there ensued. Those warriors pressing into land hesitated. Many boats shoved off of them, and men inside loosing arrows at the Aaronite lines. From the north, sails appeared. Evrain's battle fleet, bolstered by the captured galleys and the Inrathian vessels, crept towards the town under a freshening breeze. The deck braziers were lit and the ballistae ready. On the walls of the fortress the attack was faltering. With no reinforcements crossing the bay or streaming over the causeway, the barbarian effort lagged. Frantically, they threw themselves onto the shields and spears of Earl Wayne's men. They were trapped between the Aaronites and the fortress wall. Some were tugging at the boats in the scaffold-like structure. Many were fleeing towards the vessels, still looking for a landing place on the rock. The pressure on Raelf's worn-out defenders faded. Ranald raised his sword and gave the order to sound the charge. His last reserves were cast into the fray, but he hardly needed them. The great Amul host, more than half of which had not come within striking distance of an enemy, was crumbling away. Everywhere they were running, pressed back into the sea to swim for the boats or drown in the waves. The battle fleet was launching its heavy missiles into the boats, desperately trying to get out of their way. War canoes were set alight, forcing the occupants into the water or rammed into splintered wrecks, the crew riddled with arrows from Evrain's massed Aranite archers. In a daze of fatigue, Captain Raelf watched the victory unfold in front of him. From his high wall, the sight was one of gigantic proportions. The impossible enemy host was melting away. All along the shore, banners flowed, and soldiers hewed the invaders, driving them like cattle into the shallows of the bay. Evrain's tall ships plowed through the forest of enemy craft. The Amul had no thought now but to flee the carnage. Commanders were isolated and confused, unable to control the fearful warriors around them. He leaned on his bloody sword and drew in his breath. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. What a day to witness, to be alive, to share with men of valor and worth. He glanced to left and right at the exhausted men on the wall, watching the same smile reflected on their faces. Raelf of Arran sat down on the wall of his fortress and broke into hoarse laughter. Lord Karth stretched out on the narrow bed in his cabin. He leaned back on the rough pillow and closed his eyes. Within moments he walked down the pathway towards the stone marker. In all these many cycles, the veil had seen little use. If it had not been for Malik's persistent pestering and Gareth's strange intrusion, no one would have found their way here. That was partly the reason he enjoyed the silence in this in-between place. It belonged to him, and his thoughts were always ordered, his emotions under control, the perfect setting for thinking things through. And there was much to think about. The miracle had taken place. The forecast of Or's lament had become more than a mere shadow of hope. He sat down on the stone next to the marker. Slowly he spoke the lines as he had heard them in the hall of the failing King Joris. The blood of fathers brought to boldness their unwilling son. Blood is solace, blood is curse, till by blood his heart is won. It was the blood of great men that he had sensed in Rhûn, and it was someone of the unwilling man's own blood who had finally breached the fierce hate. Had his heart been won? If it had not, it never would be. But he was certain there had been a change. It had not been the same stubborn, bitter exile whose thoughts he had perceived the day before. Karth stared down the pathway to Nunmerik. The threat was there still, undefined and hidden, but potent all the same. Something else had emerged beside it, vague in meaning and substance, like a whispered word in a foreign language. He allowed his thoughts to probe a little deeper, even though he knew the risk. It was an echo of the disturbance he had felt at the boy's first coming into the Vale. Something of that first encounter would not leave him in peace. Was it guilt? He had sent Gareth to Munborg in desperation. Now that the gamble had paid off, he needed the boy no longer. That was the simple truth. Should he not let him slip into oblivion? The Viron warrior's heart had been turned. The death of this child might sharpen his resolve even further. Let him reach the shore. Then tell him the boy was dead. Would the blade not be keener still because of it? Is this not what he had envisioned from the start? The best of weapons, a flawless cutting edge. The boy was not of sufficient power yet to be of use in the coming climax. It was nigh on impossible to reach him in Nunmerik. Still, he felt the pull from beyond the gate. A man of war could not afford sentiment. A focused mind did not divert its energies towards profitless goals. The warrior knew how to sacrifice for victory. This was the hour of Horan's bid for ultimate triumph, the day of supreme trial. It would be foolish to linger over the fallen, even one's own. The resistance he could offer to Horan's scheme had rested always on a faltering foundation. Sacrifices had been made, so many, some futile, always working towards the hour of final confrontation. Now the glimmer of possibility had appeared. How could he risk his greatest, if not his only, advantage? Garth sighed to himself and turned his attention to the stone marker. He studied the engraved pointers, the names of the various destinations. His eyes fell on the words he had carved in the center so long ago.
Ne imbra e philo, ne creo tenundre.
Limit not your soul. Fear not the darkness. Yet he had allowed that fear to govern his actions throughout. Was it still doing so? Was he guilty of the weakness against which he had warned the passer-by? Ruin was a weapon to destroy the object of that fear. Gareth was a tool to acquire and hone that weapon. That was all he could see. Did he sacrifice then, even as the Lord of Deceit? Would he also consume his children to increase his power? Would he destroy Belruth to save it? Is this not his weakness, his ruin? Had he not been at these crossroads before? His great sin, the summoning, had been performed out of fear. He repented of it now. Should he not also repent of the conjured necessity that had prompted such an action? And now the Northern Prince had found redemption and purpose in rescuing what his lord would abandon. Abandon that living image of his son, so alike. It could have been Vir returning to him, without a memory of the horrible past, the rejection, the bitter spite, the desertion. Garth traced the contours of the engraved letters with his fingers. Limit not your soul. How could he even consider such a thing? No, he would not turn aside. Though his plans fail at the last and Myril disappear into chaos, he could not leave Gareth in that place to die. Let this boy be his stumbling stone. If Ruin would perish in his attempt to atone, they would both of them fall to the shadow and be the better for it. Malik was not too occupied with his plans to notice the subtle change in Elena. There was something amiss with his queen. Perhaps she sensed the end, the consummation, the final triumph. Perhaps she realized her usefulness would be very limited in the new Myril. She could be nervous about the role she would have to play then. That was all. It mattered not. There was no stopping what he had set in motion already. Across the sea, Eren in wrath would already be overrun, and Eren fighting for survival. Up north, the swarm would be knocking on the gates of Nuria. Lysanne was no more. Ligerium was in the final throes of its annihilation. Fenvale had destroyed itself. All the irritating little kingdoms were making way for the rule of Malik the Undying, a reign that would see no end. The men from Xerox were marching into Lakeside. It was a good thing the wet seasons had not yet started, or there would have been no room for the sea of tents outside the walls. The roads to the east were clogged with columns of warriors from the Fez. Within 2 days, the Munborg garrison would join the camp. Marshlanders and Hoffmen were pouring in from all over Terrallen and the Fever Coast. Hekan's raiders would meet the main host at the crossing of the river clearing into Ligerium. The contingent from Grail was already installed in the former slave market. Finally, the tour host itself would be unveiled at last, coming forth from their subterranean fastness, the battle priests prepared, the warriors trained and ready. The time had come to prevail in daylight as well as shadow. He wanted a queen by his side for these days of triumph. Elena would have to do. He decided to keep her a little longer.
No one is coming for you. They have to save all of Myril. There's no time to save little pests hidden in the ground, even if they wanted to.
Gareth's voice sounded small and silly to himself. There was a slight echo in his roomy cell he had not noticed before. He spoke louder.
I am talking to myself. Maybe it's because no one else talks to me anymore.
Janos was gone. Rune, Karth, Evrain, they were all gone. Off to save the horrible Fengor. No, Fingor would die, he had seen that. Even the terrible queen had forgotten about him. Maybe that was not such a bad thing. He was not sure whether he wanted to see her again. Elena was not like Janos. She knew the truth already, but would not admit it to herself. And she could have removed the collar, but had not, because he would not betray what he knew about Rune and Karth's plan. Gareth spent a few moments feeling noble. He had held out against her probing, her cruelty and craft. If it were not for the pain, the cold and the hunger, he would finally feel like an adventurer, he was sure. He sat up, looking about him for the cup candle. It was his one great proof, apart from the few rotten sacks, that Janos actually existed. He struggled with the crude flint till the tiny flame winked at him in the dark. It was warm and companionable, a friend. The words of Karth suddenly echoed in his memory.
You are the candle, and if you sit in the dark, it is because you have made the choice. Like the candle of tallow, it costs something to radiate light. You sacrifice your own substance. But like it also, the light is mostly for the use of others. Find someone to burn for, and it will never be dark where you are.
He was grateful now that the lost old man had come to him here in the dungeons of Lakeside. He had found someone to burn for, and the place had become less dark and forbidding. Janos had escaped the terrible prison of mind and body. His healing touch would travel through Myril again, spreading comfort and consolation wherever he went. The boys smiled at the thought of it. The little flame of his candle lit up the cell to an amazing degree. The flickering dance cast a golden light over the stark walls, the smooth floor, the rings of old iron. A deep shadow lingered in the furrow, expanding and contracting as the light moved. Gareth looked about him with interest. It was amazing how different the place seemed, with only a tiny light to hold back the dark. He moved it to and fro to make the shadows dance. Something caught his eye near the floor grill. There was a bulging object in the furrow, where there ought to be nothing at all. Slowly he crept over to the wall, holding up the flickering candle. It was a dead rat. Gareth shuddered at the sight of it and pulled away his exploring hand. The little furry body was plump. This one had not starved to death. Had it been sick? What had made it crawl in here to die? Immediately he thought of the black vapor Janos had mentioned creeping into his cell. A shiver passed down his spine, bringing the echo of pain with it. 3 enemies now. The hunger, the collar, the creeping suffocation. No, 4. There was the pressing of volatile air on all sides, filling the tunnels and cells. It was as if he could hear the old man's voice still.
It's the change of season, humors ebb and flow, robbing one of reason, steering all you know. Down and down you tumble, till the air is sick and dark. In the bowels of Myril rumble, vapors waiting for a spark.
He glanced at the small flame of the candle. Was it not dangerous to have fire so close to the terrible pressure? The collar prevented him from assessing the danger in a proper manner, but certainly it had to be potent if he could sense it at all. Still, Janos would not have lit the candle if there had been any immediate threat. Slowly he backed away from the dead rat. He would leave the body there for the others. Perhaps then they would leave him alone. There was a lingering warmth in the bed of sacking where his body had been. He settled into it again, waiting for the morning ration that surely had to be on its way. Soon he drifted off into sleep, into the doubtful comfort of the dream world. It was evening time in Kiel. Gareth walked along the sandy shore, splashing through the shallows. The small waves rolled in lazily about his ankles, leaving behind the smooth, wet sheets of sand when they receded. He walked towards the harbor wall, where 2 figures stood waist-deep in the water, their gleaming bodies caught in the amber reflection of the dying sun. They were watermen, creatures half belonging to the ocean, familiar to him. He felt the goodwill, the warmth of their companionship. They wanted him here with them. They had come to pay their respects, to see him on his way. Gareth spoke their names in greeting, and they beckoned to him. Together they would leave the shore behind, to find their way to the open water beyond Azrath Point, beyond Sunder End and Amber Vent, away from familiar things and into the endless ocean. The sea. It swirled about him in mystery and silence, the surface like his pool of mirrors, and there were faces in the water, smiling, welcoming. It was a peaceful sight, reassuring. The tranquility of it stole into him, till his inner turmoil subsided, and he became as quiet and calm, suspended in body and spirit in the cool embrace, floating away from the pain that was life. Yulan, or was it Milor, pointed out towards the setting sun. Imran's golden orb was sinking into the trackless ocean to the west. Other shores were waiting. There was nothing now to keep him in Nyril. Death would not be a terrible thing after all. Night was falling over Storr. A cold rain sifted down over the city and the fields across the dark weed where so many had fallen. Still the men did not leave the wall to find shelter indoors, from where the smell of cooking was already floating up towards them. In grim silence they stood staring at the hordes on the far shore. Somewhere among the innumerable milling bodies their king, his counselor, the Nurian host, the royal guard, and the entire Ligerian army had disappeared without a trace. Even the little pavilion where Turik had negotiated for his crown that very morning had been torn down. Lucain's firing of the bridge had bought them a little time. The creatures seemed dismayed by the swift-flowing darkweed and clustered together in groups on the bank, some wading into the shallows, hesitating. A large number congregated at the charred remains of the bridge. The arched stonework of the substructure was intact, though the sections were too far apart to leap from one to the other. If the swarm wanted to cross the darkweed, they would have to swim. A close watch was kept on the crossing. Every able-bodied man stood on the wall with some sort of weapon, peering at the masses on the far shore. Lucain looked at them, the bitterness still boiling inside him. These good folks would only lift a finger to preserve their own worthless lives. They had watched their king killed and dismembered, not 500 yards from where they cowered, knowing that he had been their only hope for survival. Already they had declared him king, probably expecting him to become the next sacrifice to their cowardice, but he would not. Before morning he assembled the few remaining soldiers, 12 guardsmen flattened by Willen on the bridge, 23 militiamen willing to leave the city behind. A commotion broke out on the walls as they prepared to sneak out the northern gate. At first he thought they had been spotted, but soon the panicked cries from the watchers indicated that the swarm was crossing over at last. In the dismal light of a rainy dawn, the men of Storr watched in horror as the swarmlings threw themselves into the water of the darkweed. Though they were swept downstream at a rapid pace, the creatures appeared to be adept at swimming, and few did not make it to shore. Once they had gained the bank, the beasts shook the water from their frames like dogs, and gathered in slow-moving clumps of threat. Already war engines and archers were loosing missiles at the concentrations of swarmlings. Lucain did not linger in the city. He ordered his little band through the gate and up the sloping road to Gerdel. Perhaps that city could be transformed in time to stave off the assault. He was convinced that Storr was already doomed. His men hurried up the steep roadway. They all turned to look back once they had reached the top of the first hill. Lucain stood amazed at how quickly the swarm had surrounded the city. Already there were spindly figures clambering over the wall to grapple with the defenders. The sounds of war floated up towards them. He stared in grim fascination. A guardsman spoke next to him, breaking the spell. "By the stone! They are in the streets already!" Lucain saw the swirl of bodies working their way around the city to the north.
Why are they not pursuing us?
The soldier's voice broke. Stor is a big city. There are many people to dig out. There was a shout from one of the others. Look! The man pointed to the higher ground on the Ligurian side of the river. The hills were alive with moving figures. Fresh hordes driven on by the scent of spilled blood.
We have to hurry.
They turned away from the scene of carnage, their hearts beating in their throats. All their thoughts now turned to the city of Gerdel and the height of its walls. Perhaps there one might be safe from this relentless scourge. The Fenvale coast had not altered in any recognizable way. It was only once ruin had rounded the headland that sheltered the large shallow bay south of Skirben that he noticed the breached sea walls and the sprawling lake country that used to be Fenvale. What the passing merchants had told him appeared to be accurate. It seemed entirely possible to sail his boat right up to the city. The favorable wind would have him land there shortly after noon. He looked forward now to reaching the capital of the Batron. It would be pleasant even to see old Javia again. He was certainly tired of the dry rations and lack of fresh water. If they fed him some decent food before sending him on his way, it would be worthwhile stopping over. His thoughts wandered to the fevered dreams and struggles of the past few days. It was somehow frightening now to relive some of the thoughts and arguments. Had he really been that close to complete insanity? Had he been the one to conjure all those phantoms from the past? Had the memories of one little boy really forced back the darkness from his soul? Why did he feel compelled to fetch this child back? He had no obligation towards him, even if he could disregard the fact that he was the son of the man who had destroyed his life. It was an extremely risky thing to do. Still, he knew that he would never have peace if there was a chance to bring the boy out of that terrible place, and he did not take it. He had the note still that Gareth had left for him in Monbourg, though the writing was smudged and almost illegible.
There are people who care about you. I am one. I know that love is stronger than hate.
There were memories, too. The deck of Kael's ship, the boy turning bright eyes on him.
If you will forget that I was Fengor's son, I will forget that you were his brother.
And then the soft touch of tears on his back, which he somehow noticed among the welling of pain by a fireside in Fenvale. Who could explain such things? Who could say why he could betray such devotion and turn around to search it out again with all his life? It did not matter whether he understood it or not. This was real and true, an action not drowned in the futile anger of his former life. Malvor scouts reached the outskirts of Amaris in the late afternoon. The column of refugees behind them would have to hurry to enter the city before dark. They climbed the deserted lookout towers to look for any signs of life within the walls, but the sight that greeted them was the same as in Nicoma. There was no movement in the streets, no bodies of fallen soldiers or townsfolk, no motion but the occasional stirring of banners in the breeze. Quickly they turned back to bring word to the captain. Haldred listened to the report with growing concern. How many days had passed since the swarm had ravaged the city? Would the survivors not have emerged by now? She remembered the waiting in Asar's shelter under Breck. Perhaps the folk here were as fearful as they had been. They searched the ducal palace by torchlight, calling out as they went. It was strange to walk through the familiar rooms, the courtyards where she had spent so many cycles. Haldred half expected the chamberlain to appear, to see the reserved smiles of the servants welcoming her back to her home. But there was nothing but shadows on the landings and in the hallways, nothing but the echo of their own questing voices to greet them. Maris led them straight to the dungeons, reasoning that these were the most secure locations in the entire city. That was where the king would have buried himself if the message had been heeded. When they came up to the locked and barricaded entrance, Haldred felt convinced that he was right. For a while they hammered on the heavy doors, shouting the names of the king and queen. Great was their joy to hear an answer from inside, and the moving of furniture and heavy beams that followed. Someone was alive in Amherst still. Tregoran stood before them as soon as the doors swung open. He did not speak, but only stared at the group, trying to identify who they were. Haldred gave a cry and rushed up to him. He took her into his arms for the first time since she had been a little girl, a great sob tearing from his throat. His voice was broken and ragged.
Am I dreaming?
He touched her hair and pressed her face to his.
Are you real, Haldred?
She was laughing and crying at the same time.
Yes, I'm real. Oh, you listened to the warning.
Tregoran's body stiffened in her embrace. He looked old and tired.
This time, my child, this time. But the one we were given in time to save our people. We ignored. I do not deserve to be alive still.
He broke off. She drew away and looked into his eyes.
None of us do. None of us were prepared to believe him. We are all guilty.
Guilty?
He stared at her, the pain written in his eyes.
I sent you to his death, with angry words on my lips. How great is my guilt compared to yours?
More people were coming out of the hiding place. Among them was the queen. Riwen saw her daughter, and a strangled cry broke from her. Again Haldred was engulfed in a teary embrace. There were no words this time, though. Nothing could be said to convey what they felt. Tregoran turned towards the men standing about in silence. He recognized Melvor among them. The Nurian inclined his head, and the former Ligerian king returned the salute in like manner. Melvor was the first to speak.
We are happy to find you unharmed, King Tregoran. We were most anxious that you did not receive the message.
I am most grateful that you remembered me, Captain Melvor, especially since our nations were on the brink of war. You had no reason to warn me, other than the memories of better times.
He turned his tired gaze to the people emerging from the dungeons.
We did not try to fight them. All those who would listen came down here with us. They numbered just over 150.
Melvor smiled.
We have not even 100 who survived the destruction of Breck with us. In comparison, you have done well here.
Tregoran shook his head.
The other cities, Eruis, Vernacum, they were warned?
If Tyrek believed the message, yes.
Again the old king shook his head.
I am no longer a king, and the kingdom I used to rule is no more.
Melvor shrugged.
I am no longer a captain, and the force I used to command was trampled by the same scourge as devoured Ligerium. As far as I'm concerned, there is no enmity between us. Let Fengor and Tyrek grab each other by the throat, while the world is burning around them. We shall escape this tribulation together.
Anik watched the ship with the familiar dark purple sail approach the quayside in Arran Town. It was strange to see it enter a mainland port so openly in broad daylight. The long cycles of covert action were over. He felt immense relief to have Lord Karth return. Having the responsibility of command resting on his shoulders was not something he enjoyed. Now Karth could issue the orders again, and he would be happy to obey them. His lord would be pleased with the work of the last 10 days or so. Not only was Malik's Southland horde defeated, they would soon be free of the last remnants plundering down the coast. The great power of the Amul had been broken. The sacrifice of Fer had not been in vain. Moreover, the bonds with Arran had been strengthened, something as essential as the actual victory over the barbarians. Anik knew what role Lord Karth needed the victorious western host to play. Slowly the vessel moved adjacent to the wooden pier. A rope was cast to the waiting men. Under boisterous command, the remaining sails came down. A plank was lowered over the side to connect it with the pier. Hunnick moved forward eagerly to greet the new arrivals. Two familiar figures crossed over first.
Tyro, Millen, you are just in time to nurse the wounded.
They smiled at his jesting, but without enthusiasm. He supposed they were sad at being left out of the fighting, especially Tyro, who believed himself a great tactician.
Where are Prince Rune and the boy?
They stopped in mid-stride and looked at each other. Tyro seemed uncomfortable when he answered and was unwilling to meet his eye.
The prince is no longer with us. He's gone out on his own. On the night we were to leave Munborg, the boy was with me, but he turned back and was taken.
Hunnick stared at him with incredulity.
The boy turned back. What for?
Rune was not in a good state. He was acting strangely and a little crazy. Gareth believed the woman whose inn we stayed in was a witch. I can only guess that he would not leave the man in that condition.
Then how was he taken and not the prince?
Tyro shrugged.
That I cannot say. But Lord Garth told me that he knows the boy was taken by the tour.
As if in corroboration of the statement, Garth stepped onto the gangplank and made his way onto the pier. Tyro turned away guiltily, and Millen averted his eyes. Only Hunnick stood with raised eyebrows and a questioning look, waiting for the old man to join them. Garth realized immediately what they had been speaking about. He forestalled the inevitable question.
Now, it is not as bad as it seems.
It is true, then, that swine has deserted us, and the boy was taken from under his nose.
That is so.
Hunnick could not remember when last he had felt such a surge of anger. That worthless imbecile, valued so highly by his lord, had finally acted out his supreme folly. Now the boy was in the clutches of the enemy, in Nunmerik, no doubt, to be broken with their cruel machines. He could choke on it. A child, crawling from the sea where he should have drowned, escaping the agonizing arrow loosed by Bior, a dead weight in his arms through the night to fur, calling out his helpless threats against those who oppressed him. He could see the bright head and lively eyes as he walked next to him, unconcerned, cheerful even, or the bare brown shoulders as he sculpted the battlements of sand on Yura Beach. And that supreme whore son called Rune had delivered him to the tour. Hunnick struggled to control his voice.
Give me the word.
Muscles knotted in his jaw.
Give me the word, and I will fetch him back from Lakeside.
Garth was not untouched.
You would go to Nunmerik for this boy?
I will tear it apart to find him, and then I will have something to say to that scoundrel.
The old man looked away suddenly. He pursed his lips and stood in silence for a moment before replying.
You are right, Hunnick, and I would go there with you, but it won't be necessary. The scoundrel you mentioned has turned around for him, and I hate to point it out, but he is closer to Lakeside than we are.
Hunnick could find no reply and merely stared at his master in astonishment. Tyro and Millen stared with him, though there was something of an accusation in their look, since Garth had not breathed a word about the matter till now. The old man smiled at them.
You have not judged him wrongly. What he has done is unforgivable. But I believe the miracle we needed has taken place. In saving the boy, he might just save all of us in the end.
Rune had the distinct impression that Javier was not in the least surprised to see him. She greeted him cordially, but with an air of uncertainty, as if she was not quite sure what his intentions were. There was something about her manner that he had not noticed before, though, a kindness and sympathy that had been entirely lacking during their first encounter. To his surprise, she had a meal ready for him, as well as packed supplies for his intended journey. The young prince also appeared to look at him with sad, concerned eyes. Both of them sat with him while he ate, but they did not speak until he had finished. When he pushed aside his plate and cup with a sigh of satisfaction, Javier addressed him with the same unfamiliar tone.
You are going to Lakeside to fetch back the boy.
Rune raised his eyebrows.
Karth told you this?
She shook her head.
It is true, then.
He sat back and regarded her steadily.
It is.
A slight smile appeared on her face as if something had been confirmed to her.
We will aid you in whatever way we can. Please do not hesitate to ask for anything you need or desire.
She nodded to Peric at her side. The boy rose to his feet and placed the bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a surcoat on the table in front of Rune. He opened it with care while Javier spoke to him in low tones.
When you find him, give him this. It is a gift fitting his station and his talent.
It was a Vadran bow, magnificently ornamented with pearl inlays and fine carving, polished to a dark shine, light and strong. Beside it was a quiver with blue flighted arrows. Javier lifted one free to show him the head. Honed to a perfect edge and translucent potency, the chrysolite caught the amber light of the lamp, in its heart a flaring fire like the rising sun.
One with a real gift may compose these in flight. Remember them when the time comes.
Rune ignored the familiar sensation that accompanied a manifestation of the art. He would not ask how they had known about his coming to Shirvan, nor how these gifts had been prepared beforehand. They loved their secrets, and he would have to get used to it. Apparently, Javier had more of them up her sleeve. When she continued, he realized she was enjoying his concealed discomfort.
There is something else. You may find it a great help if you can master it. We have used ponies from the Eastern Lands for many cycles in Fenvale. The Vadran are small and light enough to ride them. In recent times, we procured 3 breeding stallions of exceptional size and strength. They would sire horses strong enough to use for plowing, strong enough to carry men of your stature. 2 cycles ago, our foremost breeding mare foaled to give us a great horse. Guilt, they called him, after the gloss on his brassy coat and the fire in his eyes. It is said that he cannot be tamed, that he is too great to be ridden by a man. If he will let you ride him, you may take the causeway from Shirvan over the pass into Taralan.
Rune was shaking his head.
I know nothing of riding, not to mention a wild thing that will not have me.
Javier seemed surprised.
You rode the young bulls when you were a reckless youth. Is it not customary to prove one's stupidity as a Nurian growing into manhood?
That may be,
He shifted uncomfortably.
but this is different.
Yes, it is. There will be a proper seat to make you comfortable. You will have reins with which to control the animal, and if you can get it to run, you will see Nunmerik within 2 days.
He hesitated. This quick passage was what his haste demanded. Javier saw he was half won over.
Come and take a look. That won't hurt your pride any. You can decide whether you will make the attempt or not.
When he did not reply immediately, she motioned to a servant. As she turned away to instruct the man, Peric opened his mouth as if to say something, but he thought the better of it at the last moment. Javier asked Rune to follow the man to the stables. The horse was already waiting for them. He rose to his feet uncertainly. His thoughts were on the bulls of his youth, the wild straining of the animal against an improvised halter, the fierce exhilaration of the short ride, the danger, the laughter. That was no way to travel over a long distance. Yet he followed the servant out to the yard. Javier was right. It would not hurt to take a look. The boy ran after him. Before he reached the door, there was a tug on his sleeve. He had to bend down to hear the whisper.
He is not wild, not to me, only to the foolish ones who do not know what he likes. There's an old man in the stables. He showed me the trick, but I will not tell anyone, or they will make him work in the fields like a slave.
Rune's curiosity was pricked.
What trick?
The boy pressed something into his hand.
Let him smell this on you. Then you give him some to eat. He will be your friend and do what you want.
He hesitated, glancing back to his aunt.
Don't tell her this, but I've ridden on him, to the city gate and back.
There was a mischievous smile, and the boy turned to scamper away. The stable yard was an elaborate affair, completely enclosed and roofed over with high beams and thatch. Large air inlets close to the roof kept it ventilated throughout the cycle. Stalls and pens crowded the walls, but left enough room for a large central enclosure. When Rune entered the yard, he noticed a crowd concentrated round this space. He fervently hoped they were not waiting for him. Despite the boy's assurances, he was nervous about his encounter with this supposedly wild, untamable animal. He was awed by the sight of such magnificent power. The horse had a kingly air about it, from the proud curve of its neck to the sweeping tail. Rune could do little but stare at it. He had not seen an animal as majestic and beautiful before. 3 handlers were hanging on the rope fastened to its halter, keeping it from rearing up on its hind legs. They were having a rough time of it, though, for the animal seemed bad-tempered and powerful. Rune considered the tossing mane and fiery eyes. This was not a creature to underestimate. It could be even more dangerous than the bulls in Bel Ruth. All the eyes turned towards him as he approached. Rune nervously rolled the soft crystals the boy had given him in his closed hand. Could that little imp even be trusted? A Vadran man, looking nervous and apprehensive, introduced himself as the stable master. He opened the gate for Rune to pass through into the ring where the horse and handlers waited. The animal snorted loudly and attempted to pull away, dragging the 3 several feet away from the watching crowd. Javia had halted among them. She had an anxious hand on Peric's shoulder. The boy was gifted, she knew, but he was still very young. Could he have made a mistake? Had he not perhaps seen a different horse? It was true that Guilt was the prime candidate for the swiftest passage to Tyrallen, but he happened to be impossible for the Vadran to control. She did not notice her grip tightening as the tall Viron reached out a hand to the stallion. There was a gasp of dismay from the watching crowd. The horse reached for the outstretched hand, sniffing at it. There was no sign of aggression or aversion. Rune opened his hand and allowed the animal to nibble whatever he held in it. His other hand reached up to stroke Guilt's ears and mane. Excited conversation rippled through the spectators. Javia was as astonished as the rest. She watched open-mouthed as the stable master instructed Rune in mounting. In no time, the Viron had settled into the soft leather saddle, both his feet firmly in the stirrups. He gripped the pommel tightly, but this precaution seemed entirely unnecessary, for the horse made no move other than to toss its head and flick its tail about in apparent contentment.
What magic is this?
Javia glanced at Peric, frowning. The little boy would not meet her eye. He was staring out to where their Viron visitor and the horse trotted up and down in front of the stable master, apparently at ease with each other. An innocent little smile played around his mouth. Rune spent the remainder of the day practicing his riding. One of the handlers, an old Vadran who had cast a knowing look in his direction when he had given the horse its treat, gave him invaluable advice regarding his seat, the steering and control of the animal, as well as the right and wrong ways to treat it. It was to be a partnership more than a master and servant relationship. Guilt was a king in his own right, and his pride was a source of strength, which would disappear if it had to be broken. When finally he felt that he had a basic understanding of how to manage his mount, Rune retired for the evening meal, stopping only to receive the last instructions from the old handler.
Take the road through Doyle. It is the shortest route. Do not stop in the town. There is a feedback for the horse tied behind the saddle. Halt every hour or so to let him catch his breath and drink a little water. Not too much, though. Let him feed when you stop for a longer break.
The old fellow laid a hand fondly on the rump of the horse.
He will carry you faithfully all the way to Lakeside. Before you reach the city, you must release him. Guilt will find his way back to the pass. Someone will wait for him there.
He caught Rune's eye.
Take good care of him.
He held out a hand. There was a small bundle in it.
And don't forget what he likes.
They exchanged a quick smile. Rune pulled the woolen blanket about his shoulders and leaned back into the soft pillow. He had several hours to get some sleep before setting out. Who knew when he would have an opportunity again? The journey would be long and dangerous. He was on his way to Tyrallen once more. He would brave the sinister secrets of Nun-Merrick and steal away his bright hope from Malek's clutches. But once he had brought him away, there would be no more games, no more stubborn recriminations, no more useless anger. Fengor in the past had lost its power over him. He was free again, to dream, to love without reserve or condition. and to act in the way his soul dictated. Rune sighed and turned over. The excitement and anticipation made it difficult to sleep. Would Malik be in Lakeside when he arrived there? It did not matter. He would not show his face anywhere in the city. He already knew how to get into the dungeons through the slave market. There was no reason for a confrontation with the fiend. Leave the plans, he told himself. There would be enough time for scheming on the way to Lakeside. It was time to get some rest. Slowly, the peace he had felt in the boat the day before closed in about him again. The battle was over. The driving insanity had departed. What Garth wanted still did not really matter to him. Yet he was committed to something again like he had not been since the days of his youth. This Viron boy had dragged him into the whirlpool of events unfolding round the inland sea. In turning back for the child, he had chosen sides at last. In his mind lingered a troubling suggestion that it was not the winning side. Yet in his heart he knew that there was no other course for him to follow.